Hi, this is David Holmes again with the Sunday School lesson for November 29th, if you're not joining us in church in person. So the title of the lesson is A Day That Changed History. And the scripture we're going to be reading, it skips around a little bit here. It's Mark 14, 32 through 36. And then we do chapter 15, verse 25. And then 15, 33 through 39. And then we go to chapter 16, 1 through 7. So keep up if you can. The lesson focus is Jesus' resurrection brings new life. So we're coming to the end of Jesus' ministry on earth. They've spent the week in Jerusalem, and now it's the night after the Passover. So we're going to read in Mark 14, 32 through 36. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." So once again, Jesus is praying when he has an important decision to make or he's facing a great trial. And the lesson says that this time it's more serious than those that he's faced in the past. He had faced Satan's temptation in the wilderness, and then he had another temptation when he asked the disciples who they thought he was, and Peter, got upset when he told him the suffering that he was going to have to go through. But this one he described as sorrow to the point of death. So he took his 3 most trusted disciples with him to pray. Now, something to point out is that Abba would indicate a very, very close family relationship. No rabbi would ever consider using that word for God. It's a very familiar word for your father. So Jesus is he's telling us again who he is. So then we skip down to Mark 15, 25, and 33 through 39. So verse 25 says, "It was 9 in the morning when they crucified him." Then we skip to 33, and it says, "At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion, who stood there in front of Jesus, saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So we've skipped over the trial and the audience before Pilate, and we go straight to the crucifixion here. So something to keep in mind is crucifixion was probably the most shameful type of execution that the Romans employed. It was reserved for worthless criminals and those types, traitors, that sort of thing. No upstanding person would ever be executed by crucifixion, even if they were sentenced to death. Now, let's talk a little bit about Jesus' exclamation, "Why have you forsaken me?" There are several explanations of what might have been going on there. The lesson specifically talks about, excuse me, that in that instant, Jesus was feeling the kind of separation from God that we feel as sinners. Also, let's talk about the curtain. So the curtain mentioned here separated the Holy of Holies in the temple where the ark had been kept from the rest of the temple. Excuse me again. This is where God's presence was felt to be. And only the chief priest was ever allowed to go in there. And he only went in once a year. And the lesson talks about how the tearing of the curtain is showing that we are no longer separated from God, right? We don't need an intermediary between us and God. So now we're going to skip to Mark 16, 1 through 7. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You were looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So, because Jesus had been crucified the day before the Sabbath, right, there had been no time to do the normal preparations that the Jews would do for a dead body before they buried it. And so the women were coming back to do that on Sunday morning after the Sabbath had ended. And they really didn't have a concept of what was going to go on here. The thing they were concerned about is how they were going to get the stone off of the entrance. The way the tombs worked back then, they were dug, a cave was dug into the hillside, or they may have used a natural cave. But they carved a big round stone like a wheel, a giant stone wheel, that could be rolled back and forth. So you could close the tomb or you could open the tomb back up, because the tombs were used for multiple people, right? They were generally a family tomb. And they were worried, how are we going to even get into the tomb to anoint Jesus' body? It never entered their mind that something greater than that was about to happen. So let's also talk a little bit about, there are some people who like to cast aspersions on the Bible will talk about the fact that the different Gospels talk about different women being at the tomb. And they try to show that as a contradiction. So let's look at that. So the Gospels, here we have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. And then if you read in Matthew 28, it says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Luke 24 just says the women. And John 20 only lists Mary Magdalene. Now, is this really a contradiction? Think about, if you read a story about the Cowboys game, how many times are you going to see the offensive lineman named? Almost never, because unfortunately for them, right, they don't get the glory of the skill players, the running backs and the quarterbacks and the wide receivers. And so if they're not an integral part of something amazing that happened, they're not going to be mentioned. That's probably what's going on here. Mary Magdalene is the central character, so everybody mentions her, but they don't all mention anybody else because that's who they're concerned with. The other thing that people will bring up is, well, Jesus wasn't in the tomb 3 days. So he went in the tomb on Friday afternoon, and he came out at dawn on Sunday morning. That's only about 36 hours or so, or a day and a half. What they don't understand is that the ancient Jews, when they were counting time, any part of a day was counted as a day. So here we have Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, part of Friday, all of Saturday, part of Sunday. To the Jews, that was 3 days. There was never any confusion about that to them. So people that, try to find nitpicky things to tear apart the Bible really need to do a little more reading. So, the other thing is that lots of people will say, well, the Jews just, or the disciples just made up the story of the resurrection, and they stole Jesus' body so that there wouldn't be a body in the tomb. Note two things. Number one is that's the exact story that the Jewish leaders told the guards to tell when they found that the body was gone. And the second thing is, note that they're not disputing that the tomb was empty. They're just disputing how it got empty. So then you have to look at a little farther in the future, right? So if the resurrection never really happened, how in the world did the early disciples convince the Jews who had one view of the Messiah for centuries that that view was wrong and Jesus had been the Messiah and had risen from the dead to prove that? Something great happened that led to that. So the lesson closes by saying that the Gospel of Mark repeatedly says who Jesus was. At his baptism, you hear God's voice. When he asked the disciples, they confess who he was. And finally, we even have a Roman soldier at the crucifixion. And so we are always asked that same question today.